All right, thanks for everybody who's tuned in to the Corporate VCs Investing in Privacy Tech panel. I will serve as your moderator. My name is Schuyler Moore. I am currently the Senior Defense and Foreign Policy Advisor for a member of Congress. Probably wondering what I'm doing on this panel. It's because in my previous work, I was on the Defense Innovation Board, working closely with folks like Lee on a variety of emerging tech issues as they relate to government. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves first. Maybe start with Austin.
Hi, everyone. Austin Arensberg here. I lead Okta Ventures, the venture arm of Okta. We are investing in privacy, identity, and security.
Hey, I'm Lee. I'm from M12. M12 is Microsoft's corporate venture capital fund. We were founded in 2016, investing in enterprise software in the early stages, typically Series A through Series C, focusing on applied AI, business applications, infrastructure, security, and Vanguard technologies. One thing to call out about us is that we are totally financially focused and returns driven. We don't make strategic investments, so we invest independently of Microsoft's ambition, sort of closer to like a Google Ventures. Our value add uniquely though is bringing the platform and strengths of Microsoft to our portfolio companies. We have I think we've invested in about 100 companies so far, 85 active investments. My particular role in the fund is to do top-down investing and thesis development.
Thanks, Lee. And last but not least, Morgan.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Looking forward to being a part of this panel today. I'm Morgan. I work at In-Q-Tel, which is the strategic investment arm of the intelligence community. We are a nonprofit investor. We're broadly focused. I spend a lot of time in anything related to data privacy, analytics, cybersecurity in general. And I've been in In-Q-Tel for the last 3 years now. Thanks. Turning it over back to you, Schuyler.
Thanks so much, Morgan. So just to kick this off, I think level setting understanding of what we mean by privacy tech is an important piece, because obviously to different folks in different sectors, that means something very different about privacy. So maybe can we go through the panel, maybe in the same order, and talk about what exactly it means to you when you hear the term
yeah, sure. I'll start off. I wanted to highlight a few points that I think are a little bit higher level than maybe even jumping straight into privacy tech, which is, what is privacy, right? And there's the famous phrase, from the Supreme Court, I'll know it when I see it. I think the same thing goes, you know what privacy is when you lose it, right? And so we've had a lot of wake up calls, particularly around security incidents, whether it's the Capital One breach or even the new privacy policy on WhatsApp that was announced a week or two back, and you saw a huge defection go to Signal and other privacy tech tools. At Okta, we released a report, I think about 6 months ago, called the Cost of Privacy Report. And we actually did a consumer research and sort of polled folks to find out, where they sort of view privacy. And 78% of Americans, don't think that consumer hardware companies like Apple or Fitbit track their biometric data. 75% of folks, believe streaming services like Netflix and Hulu do not collect information about their online media consumption. And about 49% of Americans don't think that social media companies are tracking their posts. So, you can look at that as a little bit sort of glass half full and half empty. There's a growing awareness of privacy and where it affects different technologies that we use every day, but it's still early innings. And, I think what's really exciting and fun about, this particular moment in time is that increased growing awareness is drawing a lot of founders to start and create really interesting new tools. And so, I kind of look back at the last 10 years as, answering the question, when you look at technological development and some of the big startups that have come out of the past 10 years, answering the question around how can I suck down as much data as humanly possible to fulfill whatever business needs we have. And so, to me, the IPO and the success of a company like Snowflake is kind of an example of that, right? So you have a company that has grown to tremendous size, really on the backs of being able to consolidate a huge amount of data and create a whole new segment which didn't exist, which is this idea of data lakes. And the next 10 years is going to be something very different. The next 10 years is going to be about how to protect those massive stores of data that we create, that exhaust data that's made every single day, whether it's a consumer or an enterprise. How do we protect that data? And so, there's insider threats, which are just as important for groups like, the government, right? So trying to prevent someone like an Edward Snowden from being able to leak a huge amount of government data, and all the way to external threats, right? Which is, foreign state actors, or even, large hacking groups that are trying to attack big corporate powers. And so, it's a mix of all these things. I think there's a growing awareness and interest in privacy. And as a result, we've seen a huge influx of companies that I think are really going to set the stage for the next 10 years.
So a really helpful overview. Lee?
Yeah, a lot of great points in there. I think at the highest level, touching on what Austin just mentioned is, I like this quote from Satya from, I think, about a quarter ago from the earnings call, which was, we've seen about 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months as a result of COVID. Even before that, we've seen a tremendous amount of companies prioritizing their spend on making use of all of this data. I don't know what IDC's number is this year for how many zettabytes of data we'll have by 2025, but I know it's a lot. And with all of that is sort of a double-edged sword. The data is both used for these business processes and really generating the business value that Austin touched on before, but it's also dangerous if it's not controlled properly, and if you don't really have insight into how that data is being moved around, and what the potential implications of that. So moving forward on that, I think, put simply, privacy is all about the transparency and control when storing and sharing data across systems and parties. This can be for your products and for your customers, or for the enterprise and for the employee privacy. I think that moving forward, the holy grail of privacy tech is going to be the continuous monitoring and full end-to-end automation of privacy operations. I think we're far away from that, and I think that should continue to be the North Star, but that's kind of where I see it going. And on that, I also see privacy as a differentiator within product offerings as we get forward, as we see consumer demand for more privacy controls, for more scrutiny into how the data is being used and where people's information is stored. I think that privacy is really going to be that differentiator, and I think Apple has kind of proved out what that could look like, by really hyping up the benefits that they bring to personal security.
Lee, so I completely agree with that note that you mentioned about the IDC statistic. I see that used in so many places because it's just so indicative of how much data there is out there, though it's a little bit intangible because it's hard to grasp that huge number. But I see that used a lot in this context. And so I would say my framework is pretty similar to yours. Interestingly, this morning, I was on 3 calls before this, all of which were about data privacy. Every constituent on these calls somehow defines it differently. So this is my best effort at kind of distilling everything into a few different definitions. So I think about it in a few different ways. So for the individual, I would say privacy is control and understanding and gaining an understanding of where and how your data as the consumer is being used. Then for the corporation, I would say privacy, the ideal is having privacy preserving solutions built into every software and every process that your corporation carries out. So for example, it's having open source libraries that developers can use in their development processes from day one. It's understanding risk, it's protecting the data regardless of where it resides on the network. And when I think of, like, I'm just getting creative here, when I think of my ideal world of privacy, I envision like an app pre-installed on my device that tracks inflows and outflows of data. So similar to how you have a banking app that tracks, I paid for my Phil's coffee this morning and this person Venmo'd me and now I have it in my account. Like having that for data for the consumer, I think would be really interesting. And then having some sort of corollary for the enterprises that are leveraging your data, I think would be great, because to me, we're moving towards this like whole new paradigm where instead of exchanging money, data. So it's, I give Instagram my data in exchange for their service, which is allowing me to see what my friends are up to. So I think that's the really interesting shift that we're all engaging in right now. And a lot of what I've been I guess you could say my thesis, but something I've been really thinking about is just the paradigm of privacy by design. As everyone in an organization thinks about privacy from the very beginnings of product development or whatever project is being undertaken or being worked on, I think privacy needs to be one of the things that's at the forefront of any conversation.
That's awesome. That's really helpful. And just a flag, you have yourself gone into privacy mode. I personally can't see your video. I'm not sure if other folks can, but I still can hear you loud and clear. So at least we can continue pushing questions your way. So building off of that, I think that all three of you kind of touched on elements of this as to kind of the events that have happened and sort of the trajectories in the market that have driven this interest in privacy tech, and maybe a couple of ways that I'd like to cut it and then offer to you guys to give other ways of looking at this is kind of across industries of what's driving them to think about privacy tech differently, but then also at that individual and corporate version that Morgan was just talking about. I'd be curious to hear what you think has been driving the varying degrees of interest in that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think the danger I have is dropping a bunch of industry buzzwords that everybody would kind of nod their head. But, obviously Okta being an identity access management tool, we sort of, see ourselves as driven primarily by, the underlying trend of zero trust frameworks. Increasing ability, especially over the past 5 to 10 years, of having the fine-grained access control, the contextual access, allowing certain people to have certain access at certain times under certain conditions. That's just super critical. And, that's what Lee was talking about. And honestly, what Morgan was talking about as well, right? So initially, if you look at Okta's product, right, we're traditionally known as a workforce identity product, but the customer identity tooling is equally important, right? And so the controls that used to be really just for an enterprise user are now being transferred more to the actual individual use case. And so, I can remember like when the first privacy settings and kind of like online wizards started for Google and Facebook, and how, the whole discussion would come up about having this automatic share all feature on Facebook, right? And you have to go through the settings and actually navigate through them to turn those things off. I mean, we're at a stage now where people have a really high expectation, having grown up with social media, of the types of controls that they should have and when they should have them. And this idea of transparency is super critical. And so, this stretches across many, many different investment themes that we have certainly at Okta Ventures, but other folks do too. It's not just exclusive to us. I could talk about all sorts of different use cases, but I'll give one, maybe that's top of mind, at least for me, and some of the work that I'm doing this week, for instance. So I've been talking to a few different founders around, hospital data access, right? And so on one end, you have a hospital system that, let's say, has millions of X-ray images, right, from patients. And then on the other end, you have a really cool computer vision startup, right? Now, the computer vision startup may have a new algorithm that allows for the detection of cancer in some of those X-ray images. But the hospital system, right, can't share those X-ray images outside with any party. Or they could, it would just take years of legal diligence to try and sort it out. But there's a huge amount of value if both of these parties can work together, right? And so there's a whole slew of new technologies that are coming about, that are essentially enhancements on homomorphic encryption to allow for this kind of use case to be articulated. And so it's almost, it feels like in a lot of ways, every technological innovation has a privacy implication on top of it. But there are a lot of people that are working very hard to try and make sure that there doesn't have to be that inherent sacrifice. And so that's what's really fun for the work that we're doing. So,
yeah. I just wanted to echo those sentiments, Austin. I feel like since I've been looking at privacy for the last few years, and I feel like the space has just exploded in terms of the amounts of projects in the space and startups in the space. And for me, a lot of that stemmed from GDPR and increased regulatory scrutiny around how people share data and how corporations process data. And I think GDPR just spurred the accountability conversation, right? Like if you don't have your ducks in a row when it comes to privacy, you are now at risk of being fined for this. And that, I mean, and when there's a financial cost, people kind of wake up to these things. So I think that helped spur some movement in the space. And then we saw a wave of companies that were really riding the tailwinds of GDPR and these regulations, and that they were able to help companies comply with GDPR and make this whole confusing process of dealing with regulations easier. And I think now what I've been seeing a lot of is companies offering either approaches for privacy preserving deeply technical approaches for privacy preserving technology. So think new differential privacy technologies or homomorphic encryption companies and things like this. So I've been super interested in those vertical approaches. And I'll turn it over to you, Lee.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts, so much to unpack from what both of you said. I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting, Austin, that you were talking about was privacy as a core component to a zero trust architecture and to protecting the overall enterprise. And one thing I've been trying to wrap my head around a little bit as I look at privacy companies is what is the TAM and how do I segment the markets? Privacy doesn't necessarily fit cleanly in the cybersecurity market. It also doesn't necessarily fit cleanly in the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance market. I think privacy tech actually, if you're thinking about a Venn diagram, it's sort of in the middle of the two in an ever expanding category, which has more and more overlap between the two sides. What that means is there's different dynamics in all these markets as well that are important for startups to realize when going to market, right? Who is the buyer? Are we talking about things that are for the business users? Are we talking about extracting out business process work and looking at privacy workflows and automating those specific workflows? Or are we talking about things much lower down in the stack around data storage, discovery, inventory, tagging, which are much more horizontal? Now going full circle, more into what you were saying before, I very much think that we're moving to a space where we're going to see kind of like a classic, infrastructure, platform as a service, et cetera, market. We're going to see a solid foundation of horizontal technologies that can be used across all these different use cases, whether it's for consumer and product-related privacy that's customer-facing, internal privacy, whatever it may be. As more and more companies move to the cloud or multi-cloud or whatever their environment is, they're going to want to leverage that data more and more. They're going to look at investing in the data abstraction layer. The next step is, how do I layer privacy controls on top of that? So I think we're going to see that. And then on the vertical side, I think we're going to see one by one, starting in the most regulated industries, we're going to see companies that come out that are really differentiating themselves by becoming experts in the workflow engines related to those verticals. We're going to see folks really disrupting in the FSI space, in the healthcare spaces, in the government related spaces. And I think one by one we'll see that, which goes to an interesting question also about how is the market going to play out in terms of who's going to get huge, right? We don't have a ton of unicorns in this space yet. Are we going to see people who are starting at the workflow layer and moving down into the more horizontal or tech enablement layers sort of win out and really gain privacy tech market share? Or are we going to see some of the players that are closer to the data start to integrate or partner with folks that are on the vertical side? So that's something that I'm really looking forward to watching. The last thing I'll say related to the last topic we brought up, which was GDPR, I think there's an important set of both non-technical and technical drivers in the market right now. I think on the non-technical side, the most obvious and low-hanging fruit is GDPR. I think that set a fire under the world's ass when it comes to privacy and standards. I think when it first came out, nobody knew what that really meant. So there's a whole industry around consulting on what is it. I think when the regulation came out, the regulators didn't know exactly what it meant to a certain degree, which is fine. And I think it's evolving. To this day, we still do not have global standards. The US does not really have standards. Everyone's anticipating that's going to come, especially with the political environment and everything else. But the question is when. And the reality is that it doesn't really matter. we're starting to see companies use privacy as a differentiator in their products right now, regardless of what the regulations are, because consumers are demanding it. The other interesting paradigm, though, that's happening here is that I was recently looking at a study out of the UK. Consumers care less about data privacy today than they did 2 years ago when GDPR came out. They cared less when this was a big issue and it was something that everyone was very wound up about and talking about, but they've actually started caring a little less. The question is why? Is it because of trust? Is it because companies are building more privacy in as a differentiator today, like Apple, the example I brought up earlier? Is it because they are more educated on it in general and know sort of, it's not just this blanket thing that you can say we need to fix, that it's much more intricate than that. So I'm not sure, I think that'll be interesting to play out, but there's definitely a bunch of different things there. And I saw one comment, and I'll wrap up on this, is I think like cybersecurity, what we saw happen there was an elevation of the CISO role, an elevation of the function. It wasn't just cybersecurity wasn't just a thing we had to invest a little bit of money on to cover our asses anymore. Instead, it became, again, a differentiator. It became something after the Target breaches and all these other ones. It became something that folks knew really is going to become a major issue. It's going to lose consumer trust, et cetera. I think that extrapolating that out to the privacy world, we're going to see the privacy function start to integrate more with the IT decision makers. So what does that mean for a startup? How do you get in front of IT decision makers, the folks who are really going to be making the call on buying these technologies? When is that going to happen? And how do you position yourself to capture that?
It's a really interesting framing, Lee, and in particular about that study that you mentioned. I mean, it really is something to think that 2 years ago, people were actually more invested. And it makes me wonder if it's really perhaps this moment in time where we've been in almost a year of COVID, and the fact that people are so much more online than they were previously has almost numbed them to the idea of it. And so related to that, I would actually wonder for all of you what your thoughts on privacy tech post-COVID are, because it really is something where it's ramped in the sense that, you have this influx of data as so many people are spending much more time online. It's raised awareness for folks in the tech community who now have to think about that more. But for the individual user, what do you think is there going to be any change after COVID ends? And what is the impact for the industry writ large going to be?
It's an interesting one on my side. I'll probably have a small comment that may be tangential because I need to noodle on that to think of a smarter answer. But certainly we see like a huge influx and just fraud as a result of COVID. And I'm not entirely sure whether that will slow down or whether it just marks an acceleration point. On our end, and this isn't quite as much related to privacy in some ways, but human detection, right? Bot detection is just a huge growing area in the IT world, and for companies that are trying to protect particular assets. So you may just see, your CAPTCHAs popping up more frequently as a result of COVID. And so what's interesting is I'll tell you that there's a lot of people that don't realize that even if you're not registered on a website, there are many checks that are happening to determine your identity, not just from a marketing tech standpoint, but literally like tracking your scrolling, for instance. So about 8-9 months ago, one of the top articles on Hacker News was talking about Stripe and some of the analytic tools that they were using for bot detection. And it created a little bit of an uproar. And actually Patrick Carlson, if I remember correctly, actually responded to those articles on Hacker News because people just didn't realize that there was actual mouse tracking happening the second you landed on a page. And the reason for that is because, the amount of bots that are being utilized on a daily basis is just tremendous. And so it could literally cripple a lot of the services that we use every day. But I think that's going to be an area where, I saw some of the comments as well, is ignorance equal trust? And that's just not the case. I think people simply, in their daily lives don't realize the depth of tracking that's happening in certain everyday activities, right? Just clicking on something is determining whether or not you're a human, and people don't have an appreciation for that. So I'm curious to see how that'll change in the coming years, but I suspect that we'll just have a deeper appreciation for those technologies.
I've never thought of COVID as like the break point. So what will things be like after COVID with respect to privacy? So similar to Austin, just gonna throw some thoughts out there. So at the beginning, Austin mentioned insider threat. I think focusing on the human element of risk is critical, especially as people are working in these distributed environments. So recognizing that if you have 200 employees, some won't use the VPN, some might be working from a coffee shop. Like that has become something that has probably elevated in importance as we've gone to this distributed model. So that's one. And then the other thing I was thinking of, and Austin and I have had separate conversations about this topic, but we both find it interesting, is just around consumers are using all of these different digital tools, even more so during COVID. And we've talked about the idea of, does ephemeral equal private? So kind of in the paradigm pioneered by Snapchat, if I send someone a Snapchat that disappears in 24 hours, what does that imply for privacy? Is that more private given Snapchat only stores that message on their servers for 30 days after it's been opened? Like, that is an interesting paradigm. And I think we've even seen LinkedIn introduce like the 24-hour stories. So I've not seen anything relating to like ephemerality, privacy, but I think that is something that's interesting, has become more ubiquitous during COVID, and might have implications on privacy for better or for worse.
If I can add something to what Morgan was talking about, I recently purchased a professional version of DocSend, right, which is typically like an enterprise or a startup tool. In fact, many startup founders use it for their pitch decks. And I hadn't really thought of it until you were mentioning it, Morgan, but there's this idea of ephemeral data sharing, right? So you have the link that can expire. That's totally different than just sending an attachment over email. And so even from a corporate standpoint or a business standpoint, you present one image of your business one day, knowing that the link will expire as you choose, as you see fit. And then a week later, you have a new presentation, a new marketing deck, a new brochure, whatever it is. And so, you know, what does that mean in terms of a matter of record, or what you, how you purport yourself to the world? So it stretches beyond even Snapchat into a more corporate environment. So yeah, just something to.
And I'm going to go, so I was going to respond to that, but I'm actually going to go slightly separate, because I'm monitoring the chat as we go through, and Melanie just brought up a point that is exactly kind of what I see potentially shaping out here, which is, you know, at the highest level, tooling, regulation, and product-based privacy has not kept up with overall consumer demand, and I think the obvious need for more privacy and the obvious risks associated with not having it. So what I think we're going to see as a result of that is that the focus on privacy is going to go into enterprises' own hands. And as Melanie said, consumers aren't impressed when companies follow the law. It's only when they violate it, right? Nobody was scrutinizing what Facebook and Google and Twitter and anybody else that's using data for advertising purposes until very recently. And, you know, hopefully this video doesn't get circulated too widely, but Congress didn't even know what the internet was when they were trying to grill Zuckerberg about his business model. They don't know how he makes money. They don't know how the data is stored, what it means. So how are you going to regulate that, right? Which is why I'm very glad that we have folks like Schuyler who are going over to the legislative side of things and can help advise on what tech is. That said, I do not have high expectations of our government really being the drivers of change here. I think it's going to be enterprises and technology companies that are inventing the tooling to make it happen. I think that we're going to keep learning from lawsuits and from things that go wrong. And I think that, you know, if I were to give advice to folks on the call, and what this means is, don't wait for regulation. Don't wait for standards to come out. Like, do what your customers are asking for to the extreme, right? Build privacy in by design when you're offering your products. Be transparent. Have ways to control it. Don't get caught flat-footed when regulation does come up down the road, which it inevitably will. With that, I think that where we are right now, because there are not standards, we're not seeing companies that are really, jumping on something and becoming unicorns. Like I said before, I think that everything's evolving so rapidly and things are so individualized, like, driven by enterprises right now, that it's really going to, there's still a lot of room there. And what that comes down to, I think, is building flexibility and automation into privacy-related products as well. Being able to scale as standards change, being able to scale as more and more data is extracted to this abstraction layer. What do you do with unstructured data, which might contain some personal data? There's going to be so many things that change over time that really building in agility and flexibility to continue to comply is I think, what's going to be the key there.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And that, I mean, your comment on regulation certainly resonates with me, because it really is this fascinating balance where you have regulation coming out of an entity that itself really struggles to keep pace with the changes in privacy tech. I mean, many of us on this call have experienced that directly, of government reaching out and trying to adopt these new best practices in terms of privacy and really being behind the curve. So it's interesting to think about them leading the path on regulation. So moving forward from that, I'm curious to hear from you all what your thoughts are looking forward, of what areas of privacy tech have room for growth. If there are specific layers of the stack that you're particularly interested in, would love to hear.
Actually, if you don't mind, Austin and Morgan, I'll kind of start off here. I've been thinking a lot about this because spurred by conversations with the folks on the call, and I'm trying to, as a market analyst, I'm trying to wrap my head around, how do I size the market? How do I look for where the growth is coming from a narrow perspective, right? Whether it's horizontal technologies or vertical. Where do I think there's the most opportunity, and where can I go, for lack of a better word, hunt for those opportunities? The way that I'm sort of segmenting the stack, I think, is at the very bottom is this data store and data functionality layer, right? This is what you see very commonly offered within the public cloud, the data platform offerings that companies are using in order to extract and clean the data. Next up, which is really where you start to get into privacy specifically, is the data discovery and inventorying aspect of it. It's the critical first step to know where the data assets are and map out its data inventory. It's those tools that are really connecting with the data stores, agnostic to what the underlying infrastructure is, via APIs or custom integrations to ingest that data and automatically classify the inflow. The reason why I go into detail here before I go through the rest is I think that this is one of the most critical elements of the stack. Next up is the tagging and tracking. This is where the data is further grouped, further tagged, and further labeled. You're seeing companies like Big ID are probably, perhaps some of the most well-known there. Next up, and this is sort of where I was describing, I think we go vertical a little bit, is on the policy workflow management engine, applying policies across the tag data, enabling privacy teams to automatically patch and remediate it when there's blind spots. That's where I think you see more folks like OneTrust, Wirewheel, and to a certain extent, one company I'm really excited about, which Austin knows well, is DataGrail. And then right above that, and I think this is where we've seen a lot of activity, is at the UI visualization, reporting, and control layers. This is where you can go in and toggle what data do you want shown to customers, or what data do you want in your settings? What data do you want shared? What data do you not want shared? What is being shared? I personally think that the top layers of the stack are going to be the easier ones, but they're going to be there's going to be a lot of opportunity to make a lot of money there. But I think you have to specialize in the niche aspects of it. The bigger opportunity, in my opinion, are going to be at those bottom layers around the data discovery and inventorying and the tagging and tracking. I think that there's still so much room for growth considering where companies are in their digital transformations. They haven't even extracted all this data out yet. So the upside in the data discovery, tagging, and tracking is almost as big as the upside in the amount of data that's being collected and used by organizations. So that's huge, right? Going one step further, I do think that these offerings are very siloed right now. There's a lot of integration work to be done. I think that when you're selling into IT departments, having end-to-end solutions and perhaps fully integrated by a single provider is oftentimes desirable for easier management and security to a certain extent as well. So I do see both the bottom and top ends of the stack consolidating at a certain point, which makes a ton of room for exits. particularly when you think about sort of the big tech and security platform environment?
So I'll touch on a couple areas. Over the past few years, we've seen an increase in cloud entitlements management software. So basically tools for the enterprise where they can manage their hybrid environments, make sure that they're setting up the right controls at the right time for the right access. What's interesting is see a few different startups that are looking to do that for people, right? So, 10 plus years ago, reputation.com started out, and the idea there was, to try and manage your personal identity. But increasingly, as I was mentioning before, there's a lot of really complicated privacy controls for all these different services that we use. I personally manage them. I mean, almost every few months, I'll go back and sort of check the settings on a Facebook or a LinkedIn just to make sure that none of them are being auto set to some sort of, public profile, because I'm a bit more private than most folks. And so there's these startups that are emerging right now that are trying to create, a scanned, essentially graph of all the different data exposures that you have for your personal life, right? And create a kind of mitigation plan for them. Maybe that's the use of a password manager, or perhaps a particular vault to keep all of your ID and identity locked in place. And even myself, I just, have been onboarding a password manager over the past few months, and it's been an amazing digital audit of the past 15 years of my digital life, and going back through and deactivating accounts and changing passwords and really cleaning up a lot of the bad security practices that I've had as an individual over the years. So I think this is going to be an increasingly large, category to keep an eye out on. And I would kind of bucket it. I'm not sure if it's even privacy necessarily, depending on how you want to semantically define it. But this idea of more in-depth personal security auditing, which obviously has large privacy implications.
Great, and I'll jump in here. So I'll start with something that Lee was saying. So there are tons of tools out there, as Lee mentioned, and I feel like it's difficult for enterprises to really understand what tool is best for my infrastructure, what makes most sense for a company of 50 people versus a company of 1,000 people. Should I use a federated learning solution or an encrypted solution, or like a combination of 3 different privacy preserving techniques? So I think that's really hard. So to me, a lot of this centers around education, awareness in organizations. I saw a comment in the chat about, Carolyn, you'd create a separate data protection organization within your corporation. Like, I think having people who are thinking about this all the time makes a lot of sense. And how I tend to try to understand markets is I just look for the communities that are forming in various spaces. So the place I've been drawn in privacy is really the open source community. So OpenMind has a number of open source privacy focused libraries, and they've been developing educational content, which I need to go watch. They have this whole video series now about privacy. So I think they are a real leader in the space. They have a conference, like they're doing a lot in terms of education. And then I'll just mention 2 things I think about aspirationally for the future of security. So I would think like some sort of standard for data protection. So Lee mentioned there is no overarching data protection law in the US like GDPR is in Europe. We don't necessarily have something on the federal level. So I think it would be interesting if we had some sort of standard. So for example, the US Census last year used differential privacy as a privacy preserving technique as they carried out the census. So they were able to complete aggregate analyses of different demographic questions that they might have. So maybe if we put forth differential privacy as a potential privacy solution for organizations to start integrating, that would be a step in the right direction. I also think the point on automation, to me, this is the gold standard, because I just think automation here is really hard. Data is so varied across these organizations. You have different languages, structured, unstructured, tabular formats, all these different data formats. Like, I think it would be great to just be able to plug and play a privacy solution. Like, I'm envisioning it as a menu of these different privacy preserving techniques. You can pick which one you think might be best, but the system would really tell you what to do. And so it would be hands off. But I just think in this in our current environment, it will be very challenging. So to me, that's more of an aspirational, several years out goal.
That's a really interesting picture you just painted, Morgan. That's super helpful. So we're running up to the end of our 45 minutes. I think we just have a couple of minutes left, but if we have a little bit of time, maybe we can go around and do a quick lightning round of advice that you might have for startups that are in the space of privacy tech.
Yeah, I'll happy to start. So when presenting your company, I know a lot of times it can be very difficult for founders to try and figure out a framework by working to present your ideas. And I would suggest that people think of narratives, right? Telling a story. And when you tell a story, chronology is really important. So a lot of times when we talk to founders, they have a sense that we are totally caught up on the investor side on all the different developments that have been happening in the industry. A really great place is to paint a picture of what's happening as a beginning starting point for the discussion to make sure that the investor is following along with you. And then that naturally leads to the why now slide, which is to me the most important element of any type of discussion on technology, because obviously there haven't been many privacy conferences, right? So it's very easy to answer the why now question on the backs of GDPR and CCPA, and why this conference is even existing, why we're together here today. And so the founder is being a little bit of a history teacher when telling the story, and that makes sure that everybody's in line and following along with the pitch. The flip side of that is why now is twofold. One is why now? Why does this technology matter in the market? Why does it have a potential, to be important? But the why now is also why you now, right? And so what is your earned secret that you have that no one else has, which is the reason to back you? And I think a lot of times people forget these two really important elements, and they definitely should be sort of the beginning of every discussion that you have, and not have any assumptions that people understand where you're coming from. So this is a bit of generic advice, but something that I kind of always tend to work with in our founders, regardless of stage, frankly, even at the earliest stage or even later stage, Series B, Series C, because as you develop and progress along your startup journey, you'll find that the investors completely change as well. So,
yeah, and my suggestions would be, first, in a similar vein, actually, a articulation of your differentiation, because there are a lot of privacy tools and solutions out there. I think whoever the audience is saying, this is what we offer, this is why we're easier, this is why your life is going to be 10x better by using us upfront, has been really helpful for me. And then as you go through the conversation or presentation, everything you say kind of backs up that fundamental point. The other thing is, so Lee, I think, mentioned platforms and the idea of offering a platform solution. I would say if you're building a point solution, something to solve a very specific need, and you're an early stage startup, think about how you can broaden later. Because I've found that some companies don't necessarily think about that. And when they do want to expand into more of a platform, they run into all of these competitors and can't expand their product in some way because it's too competitive of a space and they're already incumbents or startups that are dominant. So I think thinking about that early is very important as well.
Yeah, I think spot on, again, building on that, and per what I was saying earlier, right? The way that I'm really looking at it is there's horizontal and there's vertical. When I think about the buyers in these markets, right, vertical, you're probably typically looking at more of the business users, legal, risk, compliance, those who are bringing their knowledge of how the workflow should go and trying to find ways to automate it or find digital solutions to it. Horizontally, it's all about technology that enables the control and transparency of the data itself. I think that the reason why I'm breaking these up is my advice to those two markets are very different. I think if you're playing at the vertical side, I think it's all about becoming the experts in a particular field, understanding the workflows, the processes, where regulation is going, why it's going that way, and what the demands of the users are early on, and building up repositories of IP that can be leveraged across customers and hopefully across verticals over time. I think that's the key there. Additionally, in terms of differentiators, at the horizontal layer, it's going to be about your technology. It's going to be about scalability, agility, and also clean integrations with the underlying data platforms, and making yourself differentiated enough that you're a sticky layer of that stack, that people are building on top of your product. It's not just something that can be replaced when the next best solution comes along. And I think establishing your position there, figuring out who do you want to take your bets on. Do you want to take a bet on multi-cloud, or do you want to take a bet on AWS, GCP, or Azure? Where are your bets? How can you build the best integration to enable ultimate transparency and control? So again, taking a step back, top of the layer, automation. Moving down to horizontal, it's about differentiation through integrations themselves. The last thing is luck. And that's really hard to control. But I think that, again, like, you either need to be the one setting the standards and defining where folks should be going, or differentiate through your technology and IP.
All really thoughtful answers. Appreciate kind of that summary that you gave, Austin, of like, be the historian, you know, why now, why you, and then be able to drop down underneath that why you and really break out where specifically your technology can shine. We're right a little bit over the 45-minute mark, but Lee, Morgan, Austin, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming and speaking on this incredibly important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.